is one of the biggest stars, or has been one of the biggest stars in MMA. She's a crossover star as well, which means she brings in non-MMA fans and casual fans, which is where I'd put myself at best, into the sport, because I've heard of her and I've seen her. And part of that, obviously, is because she's done a lot of promotion. What was very interesting to me was that prior to UFC 207, there was no pre-fight press conferences by Ronda, no interviews, no open workouts. That is a concession the UFC has never given to any other pay-per-view headliner in the promotion's history. How did you view that development of Rousey not doing any pre-fight press?
Well, to be honest, it was a concession that they've never made for anyone, period, headliner or not. And we're talking about, a company that's had to deal with, some prickly fellows along the way. Brock Lesnar famously didn't want to talk to the media, but he showed up. Nick Diaz. And just this past year alone, literally 8 months prior to all of this, Conor McGregor was pulled from UFC 200 because he didn't want to go to a pre-fight press conference 3 months before the fight. So, they've done, for all the things you could say about the UFC, they've actually stayed true to this. You got to talk to the media, you got to do the press, and with Ronda, they relented. And so when I found out for sure, just days before UFC 207, that she was going to be exempt from doing anything, a few thoughts came to mind. First, honestly, not all that surprised. Prior to UFC 193, when she fought Holly Holm in Melbourne, I got a call the day we were leaving. So I'm traveling from New York to Melbourne, Australia, that not only would Ronda not talk to anyone from my site, she would not talk to me as well. And I was working at the time for Fox Sports as well. So I worked for MMAfighting.com, which is owned by Vox Media. And at the time, I was doing the FS1 backstage reporting. And the reason I was told from multiple members of her team, including the UFC, was that she wasn't necessarily mad at me. She was mad at a question that was asked by a member of my team, which I thought was completely fair, on a conference call. She hung up shortly thereafter on that conference call. And as a result, she was sort of, blacklisting all of us, which, I didn't think was fair. And I've had I thought, a really good relationship with her over the years, and was very disappointed to hear this. So it kind of started actually back then. And then she loses to Holly Holm, and she actually received a ton of flack for not showing up to the post-fight press conference in Melbourne. I was there, and I did not, criticize her at all, because let's not forget, she injured her jaw severely. She had to go to the hospital. People want to pretend like fighters who got injured in the main event, lost in the main event dramatically, have always showed up to the press conferences, and that's not true. And so I think that, we owed her a little bit of, space and the benefit of the doubt. And, she went to the hospital, and I think that was 100% okay. She then put out a statement, did not congratulate Holly Holm, and I thought that was a little strange, and she kind of disappeared for quite some time. And I'm sorry if I'm going a little long here, but I'm trying to give you the whole story.
Yeah, no, we want you to go long. It's a podcast.
Okay. And so, she puts out this small statement, and she didn't even give a tip of the cap to Holly, and I thought that was the wrong move. Just say congratulations. But fine. A couple months later in January, late January, she shows up on Saturday Night Live, which was her first public appearance. And, this was a huge coup for not just her, the sport, the UFC. A UFC fighter is hosting Saturday Night Live. That's unbelievable. And we all kind of thought that this would be a great opportunity for her to sort of poke fun at herself, to, be a little self-deprecating, mention it, and then you can kind of move on with your life. They didn't touch it. And I thought that was a mistake. This was the perfect outlet to do it, because you're on a comedy show. This is great. This is what people do on these shows. She did not do that, and I thought that was a misstep. Showed up on the Ellen show. She was very dramatic. She was very emotional, and I'm not going to poke holes in that. That's how she was feeling. And sure, it was just a loss at the end of the day, but everyone deals with these things differently. And then we started to hear that she was planning a comeback, and then the big story was, okay, well, how would she be towards the media? And then Dana White said, I believe on Jay and Dan's show on FS1, he said that, she was most upset that she felt like the media turned on her after the loss to Holly Holm. And to be honest, I took umbrage with this, because the media did not turn on her. The important media that has been covering her since day one, since before Strikeforce, never turned on her. We covered the monumental victory by Holly Holm, the shocking loss, the upset, the knockout. We covered it, and we gave it the respect that it deserved. But we were never unfair. You could go back and look at all the people who cover this sport seriously and professionally and ethically. No one took unfair shots at her. And I say this because I look back, and I wanted to see if this was true. Sometimes the UFC, they have a hard time distinguishing between Twitter trolls and legit media. And I think that that's what was happening here. So when Dana White said this, I said, okay, this is a sign of things to come. It's her against the media. She's probably going to shun us. She's probably going to, we're part of the problem here. We're the enemy. And then they come out with that promo, and there's talking heads and stuff. And I thought it was so tone deaf on their part. In 2016, people had, suffered many losses, ups and downs. It was a tough year for a lot of people. And I thought that it was tone deaf to put out this image of someone who was so upset, so mad, frowning, scowling all the time. People want to get behind an underdog. People want to get behind a reclamation project. People want to get behind someone who is going to reinvent themselves, who's, turn this negative into a positive. Because for me, I'm more impressed with athletes in how they handle defeat than how they handle victory. And I think that says a lot more about who these men and women are. And I felt like they were just putting out the wrong narrative out there. And then, we find out that she's not going to talk, and, she's not going to do a conference call. She's not going to do anything. She spoke to Ellen, she spoke to Conan, and she spoke to Ramona Shelburne. The Ellen and Conan interviews were pre-planned. You know how those shows go. They're all kind of pre-produced. She knows the questions. Ramona spent a lot of time with her, and I thought it was a very fine article. It was a fair article, but it was just an article. That was it. And there was no opportunity for us to actually speak to her. And I also thought it was a mistake to not have Amanda Nunes, her opponent, go out and talk to the media beforehand. I tracked her down, and I got her in her hotel room, and she was very humble and gracious and very willing to talk, and was actually very open about everything that was going on. But if you have Amanda go out there, to steal a wrestling phrase, she becomes the ultimate babyface now. For the media, who likes their ego to be stroked at times, for the fans, here I am, I'm the people's champion, I'm talking to you, I care about you. She won't talk, I'll talk. I thought that was a misstep as well, because, there was a chance that Amanda was going to win this fight. And then we get to the weigh-ins. She doesn't say anything. And at that point, and I was blown away, Richard. I was so blown away by the amount of women in the crowd at the weigh-ins. I've never seen this before for a UFC fight. And I'm talking 12-year-olds, 21-year-olds, 40-year-olds, couples, so many women. I was actually it took my breath away, because I was like, this is amazing. This is unbelievable. She's definitely going to say something on the mic just to these people who traveled here, holidays, to come support her. It's not about the media anymore. That's what people forget when we criticize, Ronda for not talking to us. You can use the media to get to your fans. You can use Twitter to get to your fans. You can use Instagram to get to your fans. Say something to them. Tell them I'm back. Thank you for the support. People want to get behind you. They want to rally around you. And again, I thought it was tone deaf not to do that. And so, she goes out, she fights. And to me, the big question was, there only was one question. Was she over the loss to Holly Holm? Because in fighting, especially when you're undefeated, when you're a champion, the next fight is so important and so interesting, because we want to know if you're over that loss. And that was the only question. There was really one question. Are you over that emotionally, draining loss to Holly Holm? It did so much to you. Are you over it? Are you ready to resume your career? And that question was answered in 48 seconds. And there was nothing really left to say anymore. And I thought that if she would have showed up to the press conference and didn't even have to take a question and just say, I'm sorry how this turned out. Thanks to everyone for the support. I'm going to take some time, and I really appreciate everything. Happy holidays, and leave. It would have erased everything. Everything would have been washed away. And unfortunately, she didn't do that either.
I am taping this with you, Ariel, after I've already taped the guests that are coming up, Luke Thomas and Jonathan Snowden. We've taped them before. You're the last person I taped. You're starting this podcast. Those people obviously listening will know. So let me read you something Luke Thomas said, because you sort of touched on this, and he certainly, when I asked him about what he had said to me, and this is from a roundtable you were part of in February, and it's specific to Ronda Rousey. Luke says, in fairness to her, she still fulfills an enormous amount of media obligations both in and out of camp. She should frankly be commended for that, but she applies a different standard of what she'll tolerate in terms of questions when dealing with indigenous MMA media. The dedicated MMA fan base thinks as highly of Rousey as the rest of the wider world, but traditional sports outlets talk about her as if it's real-time hagiography. They pick up on none of her contradictions, problematic statements, or other areas of curiosity. She's under no obligation to speak to MMA media or answer our queries, but if all you know about Rousey is from what you read from non-native MMA outlets, there's a case to be made you're getting a manicured version of reality. This totally speaks to what you just said, Ariel, in terms of doing Ellen and doing those kind of interviews. And Luke Thomas, who obviously respects Ramona Shelburne very much, believe that even that profile fit into that Ronda Rousey sort of creating her own narrative. Do you agree with sort of Luke's statement that there maybe was always sort of a different standard when it came to Ronda, or that Ronda, as well as UFC, sort of allowed her story to be told a certain way, and maybe in a different way, obviously, than people like you and Luke and Jonathan would have done, and certainly, as those guys mentioned later in this podcast, talking about Ronda's trainer and the many issues that surround him?
Recently, yes, but that wasn't always the case. I mean, even witness the fact that post 193, I was criticized a lot. People were saying, oh, you're coddling Ronda. You know, you're not talking enough about Holly Holm. I mean, the story was, you know, Ronda's stunning fall from grace that afternoon in Melbourne, and, you know, how she was handling it. And again, go back and look. I did not really criticize her at all for how she handled it. And so a lot of people were saying, like, well, why aren't you taking shots at her? I didn't believe it. I mean, she is a legend. She is a pioneer. She is a trailblazer. But yes, it's true. You know, recently the UFC kind of kept her away from us, and it was harder to get to her. I remember when she was trying to get a fight with Miesha Tate in March of 2012 for the Strikeforce women's bantamweight title. She was, at that point, maybe 3 or 4-0 max in her career. She, you know, fought some lower-level talent, very quick fights, and she really wanted this fight. And Miesha Tate, who was the champion, wanted nothing to do with her, said, I should fight Sarah Kaufman, who's the number 1 contender. Ronda's just trying to make a lot of noise. She's trying to skip the queue. You know, this is not right. I don't want to fight her. And so Ronda came on my show, the MMA Hour, and we were talking. I would DM her, no problem. You know, we would talk, and she would reach out. She would talk openly about using the MMA media to try to get her word out there, to get her profile up. She, more so than any woman in the sport's history, got how to use the media to her advantage, and that's what she should do as an athlete. And she came on the show, and then I tried to convince Miesha Tate to come on the show as well, and they were going to have like this open debate. And Miesha was very hesitant. She didn't want to do it, and Ronda was like very gung-ho about it. And finally, Miesha said yes, and Ronda killed it. And, you know, people in the UFC told me that that's what sealed the deal for them. That's what got her the fight. She didn't have the fight. And it was kind of like this, you know, this open debate, if you will. It was great, and it just kind of spoke, in my opinion, you know, how she got it, how she understood the MMA media's role and how she could use this. And let's be honest, at that point, Ellen, Conan, they're not talking. They don't know who she is. And then she continues to get bigger. And we weren't fawning over her. We weren't cheerleading her. But again, go back, the UFC/MMA media, the people who cover this sport on a day-to-day basis, we were very supportive in our coverage. You know, there wasn't, quite frankly, there wasn't a lot of negative things to say. Yes, you know, looking back, there were contradictions, and there were some eye-opening things, but, you know, hindsight is always 20/20. Her book comes out, which was written by her sister and her, which I thought was one of the best sports books I've ever read, because, you know, not only is her sister the ghostwriter, but the sister lived all these experiences as well, including, you know, her father's suicide. So it felt very intimate. It felt very authentic. And I talked about it. And this is now coming to the point where, like, she's not talking to me as much and she's not doing as many interviews. Still, it's you know, fair, balanced, and, to be honest, mostly positive coverage. And it just, to me, it really started in like the weeks leading up to Melbourne, how that fight was announced on Good Morning America without telling Miesha Tate. And they just announced that it's Holly Holm, and then doing less media and hanging up on the conference call. I mean, these warning signs are not that old. It really started post, you know, Rio against Bethe Correia, so that's August of 2015, and then leading up to the November of 2015 fight, and of course, you know, the past year. So I can't say that it's been like that forever, but, you know, for the last, I guess, year and a half or so, there were definitely some warning signs.
What does the fact that Dana White said that this would be a one-and-done situation in terms of Ronda Rousey not having to do pre-fight stuff, open workouts, etc., and he said while he wished she did press, she had done everything in the past they had asked. Obviously, Ronda Rousey has made Dana White and that group a ton of money. But the interesting thing is, what, in your opinion, what does this mean for other fighters heading forward? And as someone who's part of the, you know, the day-to-day MMA media, do you worry at all that there would be some other fighters who make the decision that, hey, if Rousey didn't have to do this, I'm not going to play ball and do these press responsibilities?
Honestly, I and my fellow media members don't need to be the ones worrying. It's really the UFC. What kind of can of worms did they open up here? Because, like I said, with some of the most intimidating and biggest names in the sport, they've all stood their ground in front of them and said you have to do the media, and they've all done the media. But now all these names from here on out can look back and say, wait a second, why did you let Ronda not do a single thing? I thought truly, something would pop up, a Sports Center interview, something, a pre-recorded thing from months ago that they were, saving. I thought something would pop up because at the end of the day, the UFC is a pay-per-view company and they needed to sell pay-per-views. And this show was a unique one because it was on a Friday night. Typically, the UFC pay-per-views are on Saturday night. But because December 31st was a Saturday night, they didn't want to go head-to-head with New Year's Eve, so they did it on December 30th. The last time they did that was 5 years ago, UFC 141, Brock Lesnar versus Alistair Overeem, and that show underperformed. Now, as of right now, it looks like all indications it did very well on FS1, the prelims. We don't know about the pay-per-view yet, but it seems to do, a nice number, and I think Ronda was a bigger draw at that point than Brock Lesnar was 5 years ago. But they needed to go out and promote, and who better than Ronda to promote her own fight? So I thought that something would pop up, and I was surprised that nothing did. And it was very telling that Dana White broke his streak of not talking to the media at large, which lasted 2 years. It used to be a staple of Fight Week. Dana White would do a 1 hour scrum with the media before the show, 1 hour scrum after the show. He was more accessible than any sports executive on the planet. I mean, it was amazing how much time he gave us. If we never talked to him again, we'll still probably have had more time with him than anyone from here on out in the history of the sport. I mean, it's just incredible how accessible he was. And he stopped doing it after UFC 182 for various reasons. And so that streak ended 2 years later because, they were like, look, we need to do this because it's the Friday show. She's not talking. Who's the next biggest star? It's Dana White. And so I thought that was very telling. It would suck if, major fighters don't get to talk to us as much. But, to be honest, they're not as accessible as they once were. I mean, witness UFC 205 at MSG in November. We never had an opportunity to ask Conor McGregor or Eddie Alvarez, legitimate questions. So the first thing that they did was an open workout on the Knicks floor. And the UFC had one of their, reporters ask him 3 minutes of questions. And we took some quotes from that, but we didn't get to ask him any questions. And then the next day, they had a press conference, which Conor showed up late for. Eddie left in the middle. It was this whole, hullabaloo. And they had the fans on both sides of us. It was like we were in the middle of a mosh pit, a Jerry Springer show, couldn't hear anything. It was not the most ideal circumstance to actually find anything out. I actually asked Conor a question. I couldn't hear his answer, so I didn't ask a follow-up because I had no idea what he said. So for all intents and purposes, we had no outlet to ask him anything. So, the bigger the shows, usually the MMA media kind of gets blocked out. UFC does a nice job of hooking up their quote-unquote partners, although they bend the rules from time to time as to who they consider a partner, and they'll give those people, exclusive interviews. And, to be honest, it's often people who don't follow the sport and don't really know, the proper things to ask. But these things have kind of been brewing for quite some time as well. They need to be worried about what Conor McGregor thinks about this, what, George St. Pierre, if he comes back, thinks about this, because, somewhere in Dublin, Conor's, thinking to himself, oh, really? You took me off 200 because I want to go to a press conference 3 months before, and you let her do that? Okay, we'll see what happens the next time I fight, whenever I fight. So that's really who they need to be worried about. For us, we're still going to cover the shows. We'll still be there. We'll take whatever crumbs they give us. But I think the precedent that has been set is a bigger issue right now for the UFC.